Welcome to Volume 1 in the series, W SÁNEĆ, the Saltwater People, with SELILIYE, Belinda Claxton. This series is dedicated to learning about the unique and rich history of the W SÁNEĆ Saltwater People and their traditional connection to their Salish Sea Homeland, including S DÁYES, South Pender Island. SELILIYE, a W SÁNEĆ elder, shares stories about her time as a young girl spent on S DÁYES, harvesting clams and watching members of her community participating in traditional practices. She will also talk about her involvement in the importance of preserving their traditional SENÇOÞEN language, connections to the Lummi Nation, and some of the more challenging situations she faced while attending day school as a child. That and so much more. This recording was made in November of 2023 on the grounds of the SANEĆ School Board. It was recorded simultaneously with SELILIYE's cousin, Ksenia. Ksenia's interview has been recorded separately. However, there is a brief section in this interview where she talks to provide clarity. During this interview, SELILIYE will read a passage from The Saltwater People, written by the late Dave Elliott Sr. Some of the stories in this interview may be unsettling for some listeners, so please, take care when listening. I am your host, Chris Wakalek, and it is my pleasure to present this series to you. The series is made possible with grants administered by the South Pender Historical Society. I would like to thank my co-interviewer, Robert Dill, president of the SPHS. Without his help, this interview would not have been possible. Both of our voices have been extracted from this final audio in order to give maximum time and clarity to the interviewee to communicate and share their stories. Thank you for listening. Here is SELILIYE's story.
My name is SELILIYE. That's my grandmother's name, Lucy Pelkey. She was given that name to me when I was a baby. And my English name is Belinda Claxton. And I'm one of the elders here in our SANEĆ territory. S DÁYES. Yes, I got a lot of childhood memories there. That was our home away from home. We did our fishing, we did our harvesting over there, different clams, different seafood, and crabs and oysters, and fishing around the islands. And S DÁYES was one of the reef net sites for doing our sockeye fishing in the summertime. We'd travel there in the summertime and pick seaweeds and do all our work for the summer, and prepping our food and drying it and getting it ready for the winter time. There's a lot of stories that we have over in Pender Island. I remember many, many nights where we would go camping there in late fall. The people from our community from Sayout would go over there to do hunting trips, and we'd go hunting there and stay there for a few days. And I remember one time my Auntie Esther, she was married to my mom's brother, and she was from Cowichan. And every time we went down to the camp, all the camps, we were all settled and right in the canal, and had their canoes, and all the young boys and young girls and the elders were there, but we were all related to one another. And my aunt would start building her fire, and the boys would go out and dig some butter clams in the canal. And the butter clams were so big, they were probably about 5-6 inches in diameter. And they were huge butter clams. The shells were so dark, you'd think that they were not healthy, but they were really healthy. The meat of the clam was pure white almost. She would get all the clams and prep it and dice it in small little bite pieces and She'd put a couple of onions in there, and she'd make a pancake batter, and she'd mix it all together, and she would fry that and make clam patties. And of course, then the whole camp would be smelling really nice. And that was her job. That was her task. And each one of the elders and the men and the women, we had our own tasks. We all had our own jobs. But we didn't have anybody come and say, well, you're going to do this or you're going to do that. We knew in our mind and in our hearts what our job was, what our task is going to be. Ray was the fisherman, my cousin Ray, Sam. And my brother, of course, Earl, he was one of the other fishermen. And my other brother, Clyde, was the hunter. So they would go deer hunting. And like I said, they all had their tasks. They all knew exactly what they were going to do. And we would stay there for days, reminiscing and sharing food and sharing stories. And of course, my Uncle Philip Pelkey, my mom's brother, he would sit around the fire and sharing all the Quiam stories, all the stories, his life history, everything. He would share everything. And he'd be speaking in our language. And to listen to him as a child, I looked forward to them because it was just like I'm laying there watching TV, and the way he describes it in our language is just like I'm watching television. And everything was detailed. All the stories were all detailed. Creation stories, traditional stories, life history, I guess, things that happened to him when he was growing up. And I would have so much fun that the days would go by so fast you didn't even know how the coldness didn't even bother you. And we would just share stories and eat and be happy. And some of the residents from Pender, there was very few people that lived there, non-native people. The Spaldings, I always heard that name, Spaldings. They'd come and look for my dad. And Mr. Spalding would get there and he said, well, welcome home, he said to my dad. He said, welcome back home, Mr. Claxton. And I'd listen to them, and he says, I want some salmon today, or I want some halibut today. Can you get me some halibut or some salmon? And my dad said we could do that. He said, in place of the salmon and the halibut, he says, I'll give you some homemade butter and some coffee and some tea and some fresh eggs from our farm. So they would barter, they would share. My dad would go and get them the fish that they wanted. And that's how they started to build a relationship with our families. And we not only bartered with the locals, but in the summertime especially, my mom and dad used to go and barter with our relatives in Yakima. My mom and dad would dig clams in the canal, and they'd do 500-600 pounds of butters. And it was important to do the turnover for the clams in the canal because the elders would explain to us about the turnover and getting the big boulders out of the way and down the beach, and making sure that there was enough room for the clams to grow. It was always plentiful, and the new ones would come up and grow, and there was always room for them to grow. So that was another reason why that we made sure that our areas for digging clams and getting oysters and stuff was all taken care of, because the turnover was important, because it was always going to be plentiful. We didn't stick to one area for clams. We always had different spots from all of the Gulf Islands for digging clams and getting oysters. And chitons. Chitons was another food that we would get, especially when the tide was way out in the summer, early spring or whatever. And we'd have a minus tide and get chitons and crabs, a lot of Dungeness crabs. So we were always rich in our seafood. We were very rich. And my mom and dad would barter with our relatives in the Washington state. They would go and get 500-600 pounds of butters. And that was a whole day event for our family. And that was our way of getting together as a family and having that unity all the time. My brothers would go out and get the seaweed and get ready for our pit cooking so that we could cook all the clams. And they would go and get all the greenery that was required to do the pit cooking. And we didn't just go and do the pit cooking. There was a lot of prep that would go into it. Like my brother always say, Earl would always say, everything said with a prayer. So we didn't take life for granted. We didn't take our food for granted. We would always say everything with a prayer. And thank Geels for giving us our clams and our oysters and our salmon. And we respected all the sea life. And as I mentioned, that day when we were prepping for Yakima, my brothers all had their tasks. They had their jobs. We as young people didn't know. I didn't know that I'd be talking about it today. I just thought it's a life experience. But I didn't know it was my task. I didn't know it was my job. It was just a common thing. My mom would say, okay, well, you're going to go and, we're going to get seaweed today, and then your job is go and get all the seaweed and lay them out on the rocks and on the logs and let them dry so we can get them dry and take them home. And as we got older and to be young teenagers, we had a different task. And as we got older, we got more and more difficult tasks. And of course, we're told about our jobs, what to do and how to do it, how to prepare ourselves mentally, emotionally, physically, and especially spiritually when we're getting our food. And that day that we did about 600 pounds of clams, my brothers went and got all the seaweed and all the greenery and the cedar. And then my other sister, my late sister, would do the fires. She would get the fires running. There was 2 fires. And then my other brother would be getting the pit together, digging the pit down the beach. And the pits were pretty big. They were like 4 feet by maybe 5 feet deep or something. And there was special rocks and special greenery. Everything was special. All the material that we used to make our pit cooking a success. And the seaweed was, like I said, it was for our pit cooking. This was a preparation of preparing all our clams and cooking them and drying them. So that's why we needed the seaweed. And to cook that much clams, it required a big area to cook it. And pit cooking was our main way of cooking and preparing our food for our winter supply. The pit cooking would make it's easy for you to cook butters and then maybe putting your meat in there. You're cooking your deer meat. It was the quickest and fastest way of cooking big meals for the community. But most of the time, the pit cooking would always be in the summertime because it was our way of cooking large amounts of food and prepping it, drying it, getting it ready for the winter. Once we prepared our food, it took us the whole day to prepare that. the digging of the clams, preparing it and cooking it and drying it and getting it all ready. There was not too many automobiles in our community. They had, the odd person was fortunate to have a car. My dad had a vehicle. It was an old car. Our butters would be all ready and dry, smoked. They took the butters and weaved it into a necklace, a cedar necklace. They took a cedar rope and made a necklace out of it. And there would be about maybe 5 or 6 butters on it per necklace. And they'd be nice and dry. And we'd go up to Yakima and barter with them. All those 600-700 pounds of butters would be gone in about 10 minutes because they just couldn't wait. And they had games in the summertime, the Yakima Indians, and of course our people too as well. And they used to play bone games. It was our way of kind of betting. They would bet different things. The bone games would go on maybe from a day, depending on what they're betting. It could go on for a week. It wasn't just money. Sometimes there were for horses, other farm animals. I know that Uncle Philip and my mom shared a couple of stories about that. So anyway, when we bartered and traded, because they gave us beads and blankets in exchange for the butters, the clams. And they looked forward to those clams because when you're in those gambling games, you couldn't leave for days. And of course, you're hungry. So with the necklace of clams, you could just sit there and eat your dried clams. And they didn't have to leave. So that was, an experience and something that, that I witnessed when I was a young gal. And so that was one experience that I had with bartering. So we not only bartered with our friends from the Gulf Islands in exchange for butter and tea and coffee and flour, but we were able to go and exchange with the Yakima Indians. And of course, our relatives are from down south in the Washington side anyway, so we'd go and visit them anyway, and there was no border for us. We have SENÇOÞEN speakers in the Lummi tribe, and so we would go and visit for a few days before we come home. So that was, I guess, one of our ways of getting food and coffee and tea. And as I had mentioned before, that selling fish to the different fishing places here in the community, we weren't allowed to sell our fish anymore. So we were wondering, what are we going to do now? We can't. That was our way of getting flour and sugar and coffee and tea. Our young men and women said, okay, then, well, how about if we start selling greenery? Greenery meaning boxwood branches to the florists. So that was our other main source of getting money so that we can get our basic necessities. And then that went very well. So we had a lot of florist stores where we were able to sell our boxwood, the different types of greenery that they wanted. So that went for a few years, and that was something that we were able to secure some funds. And like I said, we weren't on welfare at the time. That was our way of getting a few dollars for gas and getting our necessities. And as time went on, of course, Indian Affairs got a whiff of that, and they put a halt to that again. And they went to all the florists and said, don't buy any greenery. If you guys continue doing this, we'll close you down. And then again, we couldn't sell any greenery anymore. So it was very difficult. And then in Indian Affairs, as time went on, then that's when they started introducing It was not welfare. It was monies that we got, but it was not called welfare. I can't remember the name of it. It was a few dollars for each family anyway, and they introduced it to us, and as time went on, of course, it turned into welfare. And now that's another thing that we're trying to teach our young people, not be on welfare anymore, because we lost our independence that way, which was really sad, because that's when education became a priority. We couldn't get any other monies for our necessities. So then our elders and our parents said, okay, now we got to start pushing our kids to stay in school, get an education. And my mom was an advocate for that, because she never did learn to read or write. And she said, stay in school. She kept telling her grandchildren, stay in school, stay in school. That was, you got to learn how to think like the Juanitams, she said, like the non-native people. You got to learn how their way of thinking. Stay in school, she kept telling us. And of course, my brothers and myself, we went to day school. And for me, they just kept pushing us and stay in school. And they would pass us to the next grade, even though we had D's and F's. They still pushed us into the next class, next grade, I mean. And we got to a public school and we had horrible marks, but it didn't matter. Indian Affairs still kept pushing us, and it didn't matter. Even though we had a bad report card, they still put us in grade 7 in a public school. So my generation, our education was very poor. I learned how to pray, I think, more so than I did how to do English and math, because we had Catholic priests and nuns that taught us here at our school, at the day school. And so I learned a lot about communion and religion, Catholic religion, and learning about a little bit, I guess, about the Bible, I guess, and they taught us about, us kids were going to go to hell if we didn't pray. And they even showed us pictures about what hell looked like. And it was not a good time in day school. Our grandparents and our parents were very, 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 very traditional. Our language was pretty strong at the time. Before residential school and day school came around, the experience, like I would mention when I went to STAYES, I'd sit there and listen to the stories that my uncles and my aunties went through, their life experience, what they went through when they were young. And it was very traditional. Our Huyam stories, our traditional stories, they were real. They were real. It happened. It wasn't just a story. They actually experienced it. And those are the stories that I'd sit around the fire and hear them sharing their stories, their life experience, what they went through when they were young kids or a young teenager, what they went through. And that's where our teachings and our values came from, because it was an experience that they went through. And that's why my grandparents and my mom said, if my brothers would go fishing and my brother Earl would get a halibut and there was a red snapper there, my brother would have to do introductions. He would introduce the red snapper to the halibut, because they were related to each other, because the Gels came and changed us into a tree or sea life or an animal. That's why I was saying life experience was real. and we were changed into something. So my brother would always have to conduct himself in a traditional way. And I guess that was the transition, that it was still kind of live, I guess, when my brother Earl was a young man. He was the oldest in our family, and he was born in about 1932 or 34. At that time, then, it was his life experience, and it was real. My brothers and sisters were all 2 years apart, and as I'd mentioned when we were sitting around the fire, the transition to passing on our teachings and our values was an everyday thing. It was a common everyday thing. When we went out to do something, my mom would say, okay, well, before you do this, you got to do this, and you got to pray in your own way, and you got to honor Chel, our creator, and before you harvest or whatever. Every step that I took in my life as a young gal and as a kid, it was a teaching, it was a value. But little did I know I had to share it with my young nieces and nephews and the young kids that we have today. Little did I know that I was going to be teaching them. I guess we were already in the transition of changing. I guess my Uncle Philip's, my mom's brothers, in their days, even my grandfather, Yalquetza, he was already seeing the change already. That was my dad's dad. So I would think in about 1920s maybe, or even earlier, they were already seeing the change already. Things were already changing to be, what's the word for that? It was already getting to be
colonized.
Yeah, yes, that's what it was.
Change our way of thinking, change our way of life, change our whole attitude towards living. Make us forget our traditional ways, make us forget our language. It was all planned that way. That was the whole idea, to remove us from our way of life. If you look at it, it was all done in such a way that, well, you can see the results now today. Our children don't speak their language anymore. Our people don't travel about on our territory and live off the land anymore. We don't have our traditional values and ways anymore, hardly any of it. And the whole idea was to take the Indian out of the Indian. And that's what my dad used to say, because he used to say, without our language, we will become nothing more than brown white people. Without our language, because within our language is all the values and teachings of our way of seeing the world and how our Creator wished us to live here. I think that there's a lot to be said about, I guess, boarding school and day schools. That was forced on our people, and if they didn't comply, they were put in jail. The parents were put in jail.
I mean, who would ever think that things were going to change like that, from us being very traditional, my grandparents and my great-grandparents. But it was everyday common things, like having a relationship with the land and the animals and the birds and the bees and everything. Having a relationship with the sea life, it's changed drastically. Some of our young people, they're starting to see it, but the belief is not there. It's there, but it died when we gave up our language. That's when it died. Our beliefs and our teachings and our our way of life, it died with the language. And I guess there was still a little spark. I was fortunate that my mom lived to 93 years old, and she was able to teach me that before she left us. And my brother Earl, he was the storyteller, I guess, too, along with my Uncle Philip, my mom's brother. He was the main storyteller, I guess you could say. He had many, many, many trips to the Gulf Islands, and he could just go on and on and on and on about his way of life, our way of life. I used to could sit there and listen to him for hours on end. He would be talking in our language and sharing his different experience that he went through. And it was just absolutely incredible. I would be at awe listening to him. I guess I'm one of that was fortunate to hear that from him, because all my other cousins that understood the language, they're all gone now. They all left us. My Uncle Philip was a true SENÇOÞEN speaker and storyteller. Everything that he said and everything that he did in life, like my brother would say, everything said with a prayer. And I guess then my brother Earl took it over eventually, and then he started sharing his life experience with my cousin John Elliott, and my other cousin here, Quissinia, started sharing their life experience. And when day school and residential school came into our lives, I guess pretty well raped us of everything that we knew. I thought it was gone for good, but then I guess as time went on, as I got older, then I thought, okay, yeah, I remember that. And I remember when my mom told me that, when we go out harvesting cedar or getting medicine, okay, I remember she told me this. And then I started remembering in my own mind about my life experience, what she taught me. But I didn't think it was going to be important. I always thought it was just an experience, because her life experience, her brothers went to residential school, and she had to stay home and look after my grandparents. And she was really upset about it. She was very disturbed about it. She really wanted to learn to read and write. And then Earl tried to tell my mom, it's not really important, Mom. You could just scribble and that'll be your name. My brother used to say that to my mom in our language. It doesn't have to be legible. You don't have to read it. And she got to be very active in keeping the language. She started working with many linguists, and they started recording her, and working with Quissinia's dad. And then it went from there. And if it wasn't for Dave and my mom and Ray and Teresa and the other few elders, just very few that I mentioned, that kept our language alive. And we were very fortunate that we got our dictionary, and the language is alive. And we're teaching our young people, and they're speaking the language fluently. And it's nice to hear. Very, very nice to hear. One young lady that I'm very proud of, I keep telling them, concentrate on the accents in our language is very important. Very, very important. I said, listen to my Uncle Philip's recordings and my mom's recordings, and to Dave, Elliott, and all the other elders. Listen to their accents. It's really important. And she took it to heart, and she brought me to tears, because I can hear my elders in her voice. I can hear my elders in her voice. And I thought, wow, I didn't think I was ever going to hear it again. She just spoke it so clearly and precise, and she had that accent. And it's alive. Our language survived. But the language is so important to all our livelihood, what we do in our lives. If we go and harvest cedar, or whether we get medicines, or go out clam digging, or go out fishing, or whatever our activity is for the day, the language goes hand in hand with it. So it's very important. So not just with the islands and Pender and Saturn, everything that's related is very important. Our place names of all the Gulf Islands is very important because it talks about what it means. What does SENÜOFEN mean? All our place names, what does it mean? It's all related to that piece of land, that what happened at that time. It's very important. I think when it comes to our young people, we're sort of still halfway in our transition yet, because we were totally immersed in our language and our identity, our living, our tradition. It was practiced, and it was every day. It was a daily ritual for all of us. And those rituals that we followed was for me, for my youth, and how we conduct ourselves as SANEĆ people. We were rich people. We had a lot of land. We had a lot of food. We had everything. We were free people. There was no hatred, no anger, no resentment, no jealousy, no remorse. We lived in peace and harmony. There was no one competing with another person in our community about trying to get rich. The only richness we had was our seafood and our food and how we lived in our livelihood every day. And having to respect everything around us, and our land and our sea life and everything around us was the purpose of keeping SELILIYE alive. It was going to feed her. She was going to drink from it. She was going to eat from it. And how we conducted business was not just for me, but it was for our future, for our kids, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and so forth and so forth. It was not just for me. And that's how we conducted life. We all lived in harmony and we lived in peace. And then when the transition of the Europeans, when they came to us and they started expropriating our land and our resources, our fishing, to just get rich, because all they wanted to do was just get rich and monies. That was their focus. And us, we couldn't understand it. My grandparents couldn't understand it. And all we thought about is, what are we going to have for dinner today? Oh, we're going to have a salmon. My mom would tell my older brother, we'll just have a salmon for lunch today. And we only took what we needed. We didn't exploit it. And that was our teachings and our values, taking care of the land and everything around us. And everything that we stood for as SANEĆ people, it was for our benefit. Especially having to know how to read the weather and how to look after everything around us, and how to understand the waters, understand the animals and plants. And that's why I grabbed this book today, The Saltwater People. Today we're in a part of a world that uses clocks and calendars and daylight savings time, but once we used a system that was better for us. Before the coming of the Europeans, we were in touch with nature. We used the universe as our giant clock. Our culture and our survival depended on time of man and nature being one, so much that we planned our lives around it. The moons told us of our change in weather and signaled our food gatherings, spirituality, and our social activities. Because we were the saltwater people who once lived as much on the sea as on the land, the tides were the clock that fixed our daily activities. The moon that signaled winter storms also warned us to put our paddles away and stay on land. Some moons were also signs to prepare for the annual cycle of the reef net fishery that distinguished us from the other people. As a people without any major rivers, we learned to create artificial reefs when the salmon passed through our straits. Our calendar has 13 moons rather than 12 months. The names of the moons signifies their origin and their purpose. In our tradition, like the names of places and persons, they are sacred. They're very sacred. They explain their place in the universe. We shared this calendar with the animals, and science now confirms what we've always known, that the salmon people use the moons and the sun to navigate and to know when to come back to us. So the 13 moons is what governed us. That's how we conducted life. That's why I was saying that we lived in harmony and peace. We lived with the animals and the sea life. And we lived in peace and love. And so when the Europeans came, it changed our whole livelihood. It was such a drastic change in the harmony of our SANEĆ people. So drastic that it killed us off. Their main focus was to kill the Indian in us, and it's still going on today. And we're still trying to survive from that. We've lost a lot of our relatives through day school and residential school. And for my nieces and nephews and our own young people, I guess I could say that through living the white way, living with the non-native people and going to school with them, I was always lost. I could never find any peace out there. Being on the reserve, I guess I felt comfort. I felt loved. I felt a little bit of peace, a little bit of harmony. And then one day I decided, okay, I'm going to move off the reserve and see what it's like. So I moved off the reserve, got a government job. I got what you call a mortgage, bought a house. But I was still discriminated against. Even though I tried to live their way, I was still discriminated. I still wasn't happy. And I moved back home, and we have a lot of our relatives that live in the urban setting. And being in an urban setting, because we got no more land to house them, our land was taken. All the Gulf Islands belonged to us. We had no boundaries. We would just say, okay, they're gonna do the reef net today. We're gonna go to S DÁYES because that's where our reef net was. Our site was there. We didn't have to ask for permission. We'd go and do the reef net technology and do our practice. But today, now we have a boundary of where we're going to go now because Indian Affairs has changed it. so drastically that it's actually killed us off. It raped us. It took our language, our identity, our teachings, our values, our everything. And through that, through our young people trying to find a sense of normalcy, drugs and alcohol came into play. And that's killing us. They're trying to find it in those addictions. And because of what they've experienced in residential school and day school, it goes from generation to generation. So I always tell my grandchildren, don't lose who you are as Saanich people. Because they're always going to have that in the pit of their stomach, that they're Saanich people. They are rich. They are rich in knowledge. They are rich in identity. They are rich in their culture. They do have a sense of belonging. And that's here in Saanich. No matter where we turn around and we look around, like my cousin's right there. In all the 4 communities, we're all related one way or another. And we always share stories like I was sharing earlier about our fishing sites, our gathering sites, our medicine sites, our animals. And we had a relationship with our environment. And like they said in the calendars, the 13 moons, that's what governed us. And then when the Europeans came, they took all that. We lost our sense of value, our sense of identity, our sense of belonging. And yet our kids are still looking for that in alcohol or drugs or adults or whoever they may be. I said, you're not going to find it if you take your language, learn about our language, learn who we are. They got their pride and their identity back, a sense of belonging. We may not have our lands. We may not have the day where I experienced when I was in S DÁYES. I could sit there and listen to all the elders. They'd be all speaking, sharing stories, and I could understand every word they said. I could understand the experience and what they went through, our traditional stories, their life experience, the do's and don'ts of becoming a young man or a young lady. I can understand everything. And that's what kept SELILIYE alive. That's what kept SELILIYE alive. If I lost the language that taught me who I was, I would have died from alcohol abuse or drug abuse. I would have been still searching out there. And today, we're still at the fight of Indian affairs. We're still there yet. We're still trying to save ourselves, I guess. And they still don't want to admit their wrongdoings. And I always tell my grandchildren, stay in school, go to college. And that's what my nephew does today. Yelquetza, Robert Clifford. He's got his PhD in law, and he's married our traditional laws into the Huritam laws when it comes to lawyers. Because we have laws. We have our traditional laws. That's what governs us. And I always tell our young people, we are rich. We've got all that knowledge. We've got all those teachings. It's always been there within a pit of your stomach. We just have to wake it up. The language, the teachings, everything is there. Just got to wake it up. That's what I want my young relatives to know. They just got to wake it up. Don't go out there and search in the land that's foreign to you, because you're never going to find it. I went and searched and I never found it. I thought living the white way was going to make me happy, but it didn't. I learned to pay taxes. I learned to pay property taxes. I learned to pay taxes through my job. For nearly 10 years, I would have had my 10-year pension, but they took it away. The government took it. They told me that I took my superannuation, that they would clear my personnel file. They just said, just sign right here, Belinda. Little did I know I was signing my pension away. I had 3 months to go. Little did I know I was signing to give away my pension. That's when I realized I can't live out there. So I came back home. I came back home, got a job, learning the language, sharing my life experience, what I went through, and with my mom and my dad and my brothers. And you can't give up who you are. It's just like any other people out there, like the Scottish people, Italian, whatever nationality. You've got the same thing, same identity, same teaching, same values. But ours is our SANEĆ ways. And we had a lot of land, but we don't no more. Like I said, we were free people. We could come and go as you please. But through history, my brothers and my mom and my dad and uncles and aunties, it just gradually got taken away. And I hope that one day one of our young people, our SANEĆ young people, will maybe get their PhD and do their dissertation in history of our SANEĆ people, and maybe one day we'll have a history book about who we were, and we still are. I keep encouraging them, because it's got to be told. It's got to be told what the Europeans did to us. And like they said, they tried to kill the Indian in us, but no, it was still in the pit of my stomach. It's living through my nieces and nephews, my cousins and my aunts and uncles. It's still there. And now the young people that are speaking the language now, today, they're happy. They got families and they're being a healthy parent. And it was simple as just speaking your own language.
Thank you very much to SELILIYE for doing this interview. This interview and the entire series has been made possible with funding from the Capital Regional District, the Pender Island Community Resource Center, the W SÁNEĆ Leadership Council, W SÁNEĆ School Board, the Pender Islands Museum, and the South Pender Historical Society. Thank you to all these organizations for contributing to make these recordings possible.